What's up, everybody, and welcome to Real Time for the Real Everyday Movie Fan. I'm Ryan Murphy.
And I'm James Sheridan.
And today we are engaging the Borg. Welcome to the second episode of our review through of the Borg episodes of Star Trek. We began with Q Who last week, and this is the big one, right? This is the best of both worlds. This is, and that's just exactly kind of what this episode is the big one, right? It's like as we go through the next, if you go through the next generation, third season is definitely where it finds its feet.
Yeah.
I always say, like, if you look at the seasons, it's like, well, season one you got Tasha Yar, in retrospect doesn't really fit just because she left so early. In season one you got Tasha Yar and Riker has no beard and they're in their dumb pajama jam uniforms. And then season two, Tasha Yar leaves and Riker grows a beard, but now Crusher's gone, and they still have their pajama jam uniforms. Season three is kind of where everything kind of, began to coalesce into what we kind of know more as the next generation. Crusher came back, and they got their cool, sort of iconic uniforms that we know and love. And also, I mean, even like something as it sounds silly, but um, they entered a new decade. It became the '90s in season
Mhm.
three, and
This is
yeah.
also often cited as like the episode that kind of like we talked about it with Q Hugh that Star Trek The Next Generation started to pull out of the shadow of the original series. This is where it was like definitively, oh, this is its own thing. It's not just like
Mhm.
rehashing the original series. It's taken its own trajectory. It's like the beginning of sort of them moving away from Roddenberry's very strict, very sort of rigid. There's no conflict in space kind of thing.
Mhm.
Like this episode is just rife with conflict throughout,
Mhm.
and really tonally, it's you can really see like this is where classic TNG really feels like it's coalesced and has become its own thing now, and it is what I remember TNG being, um,
Mhm.
and like it's also notable because this is the first cliffhanger in Star Trek
Yes.
history. They'd had two-parters prior to this. There was a two-parter. I can't remember the name of the episode.
The
In
menagerie in the original series.
Yeah, in the original series, and Farpoint was technically supposed to be a 2 hour event,
Mhm.
not a split episode, but in home video and syndication, they split it into two parts. This was intended to be a two-parter. It was intended to be left on a cliffhanger, and my God, that's one hell of a cliffhanger.
I mean,
Um,
we can skip ahead and say this. It's the most iconic, if not the most iconic cliffhanger in television history. It's certainly the most iconic season-ending cliffhanger.
yeah,
And I don't know how many shows besides Star Trek have done the season-ending cliffhanger. Well, Smallville used to do it every season. That was Smallville's thing, but Smallville kind of sucks in comparison. But yeah, you're
I
absolutely right.
mean,
This was yeah.
cliffhangers happen, but it was like this was a whole different level. It was an event, and it was intentionally designed to be sort of a precursor to building towards season four, leaving this on
Mhm.
such a sort of like shocking note and building towards what would be season four, where like CBS was actually promoting an individual episode, not doing like just the weekly promotions, but like all summer long was like teasing the idea of like what's going to happen to Picard, what's going to happen to the crew. Like we leave on like one of the most iconic bits of dialogue in all of Trek, Mr. Worf fire, and like
Mhm.
you don't know what's going to happen. You really like it to the point like not only did we not know what was going to happen, they didn't know what was going to happen. Famously, they kind of left it with like this intention of like we'll leave it on this cliffhanger and figure out what to do with the
Yeah.
conclusion when we get to the
Well,
next season.
there's a great story about that Brandon Braga, who became such a big writer in Trek, started working in season four. He was brought on in the new season for season four.
Mm-hmm.
So he walks onto the lot, starts meeting people, and he stops into Michael Pillar's office. And Michael Pillar's sitting at his desk and looks up at him and he goes, "Hi, I'm Michael. I'm trying to figure out how to kill the Borg. I have no idea how I'm going to do it.
And fun, what another aspect of this that now you brought up Pillar is this. There's a fascinating sort of parallel through this episode where Riker is kind of forced to question his sort of position within Starfleet and the Enterprise, where at the very beginning we find out he's been basically granted commission to be captain of a new ship, and he's kind of there's a point in time where he's starting to question, like, why am I still here? Why am I delaying this? I used to be such this young, brash, impulsive, ambitious guy who was like rising the ranks very quickly, and he sees that in a parallel with Shelby being that sort of same ambitious sort of like go-getter, trying challenging him for his position on the Enterprise, regardless of whether or not he leaves. What's fascinating is that Pillar was actually sort of going through a similar thing where he wanted to leave Star Trek, and he was questioning, like, why am I still here? What am I doing here? What is my purpose within this? And the Roddenberry and I can't remember the other guy's name. Someone else basically like kept pushing him. No, you got to stay. You got to stay. You got to see this through. So I kind of love that, like that real life aspect of this kind of informed part of the story in the script and much of the humanity of this episode, because of course, again, we're dealing with an entity, an enemy that is basically faceless until it isn't in this episode, but for the most part, it's sort of a faceless, force of nature kind of species that isn't, it's not the Klingons where you're kind of like there's no personality, there's no individuality, there's no like representative of the Borg. It's just sort of like this horrifying kind of like collective. And again, we went over like just why the Borg are such a unique individual or unique kind of horrifying species in the last episode. But that like it leaves you without having sort of anything to kind of work off of other than the horror kind of thing, because there is this sort of looming thread of like very early on they say like, we're not ready. Admiral Hansen says we are not ready, even though they've had this year of preparation basically, and they mount a very formidable sort of defense against the Borg. They don't have the weaponry, they don't have the technology, they are not prepared for what is coming, and they basically, spoilers, but get their asses handed to them. And I don't know, I like that there is this aspect of humanity within this episode of like, Shelby trying to challenge Riker and Riker trying to figure out what his role on the ship is. And, we end on this note of like, he's basically forced to take over. His captain has been taken and assimilated. And, he has to make this very tough choice. Like Shelby keeps saying to him, if you're not going to make the tough choices, move over for someone who will. And he's forced
and the episode
to make
ends
the
with
toughest,
him like with Crusher.
making the toughest choice of all.
Yeah, but like he makes it like very like Crusher is like let's save him. Let's and
Even Shelby,
like
Shelby's saying, give us time. We can figure this out.
Yeah. And he's the one who's like best friend he is, and he's like, no, fuck it, we're gonna murk this son of a bitch.
Yeah. And it's like it's such great writing. It's such a great sort of build up towards that moment. And then they leave it on that moment of like, are they actually going to kill him? Are they actually going to try and destroy this ship with this strategy they've developed that could ostensibly work as far as they know, as far as we as an audience know? Is this the end of Picard? Is this the end of the Borg? But yeah, it's I don't know. I really, really enjoyed the writing in this episode. A few little snags here and there. I'm still not sure what Guinan is doing. I was actually surprised. Like I've recently not just QU, but I watched all 4 of the like sort of core TNG Borg episodes. I just finished watching QU this morning, or not iBorg this morning. And I'd forgotten that Guinan was in all of them, but doesn't really help anything. Like in this one especially, she's just sort of there and like kind of like waxing philosophical with Picard as he's doing the sort of like fatal or the like
You walk through the ship.
yeah, he's
Kind
doing the
of
walk
like
through the ship that's supposed to be done before, a battle you can't win kind of thing. And then, he waxes philosophical about Nelson at Trafalgar, and she reminds him
yeah,
that Nelson doesn't
which is
return. And it's
I
like,
love a good history reference
and
in
it,
Star
but
Trek.
it's also fascinating because it's foreshadowing for what we're kind of left with at the end of the episode is like, we don't know if Picard's going to return from this battle.
Yeah,
And like, I, it's a little heavy handed in the episode, but like, I mean, that's Trek. They like to have those sort of illusions that are heavy handed, but yeah, just the writing in this episode was so good. And I'm like, I mean, I don't, anyone who knows these episodes, um, knows just how good they were,
yeah.
uh, what they meant to Star Trek, what they meant to the Borg storyline. And I mean, this is the heart of the Borg storyline. This is like,
Well, it's you
it's
said it
the
last time. This is kind of
centerpiece.
it. This is kind of it for the board. Like we
Yeah.
have Q, which is like the lead up, and but then we have this, and then they never know what to do with them, so they just bring the only thing they do is do Iborg, which is a nice emotional story. But like this is the only really real appearance of the Borg as a big threat until First Contact, the movie. So it's like but it is, you're absolutely right. It is designed to be, it's designed from the get-go to be like the big one. And like when you watch the episode, it opens up and it opens up on this eerie music. Like right off the bat, it's like it's like
Yeah.
right off the bat, they're like letting you know, like, oh, we're not fucking around this episode. Like, Captain's log, we are fucking screwed. And well, first of all, let me say, I wanted to get this out there is that a couple of the guest stars in this episode are notable. Elizabeth Dennehy, who plays Shelby, obviously she was brought back 30 years later for just to get like straight up like I want to use the word murked less. I need to get a urban thesaurus out, but she gets straight up shot in the face.
Well, what's even more fascinating with that is like in doing the research for this episode, I went back to watch some of the Borg references because Picard makes like their Shaw's speech about Wolf 359, which connects to the
Yeah,
next episode, and Shelby, of course, returns as the admiral of the fleet for the big Federation celebration, the
which
250th
shows that her
anniversary, where they're doing
ambition
the
paid
parade.
off.
But
Her ambition paid off because
there's a
she's yeah.
great bit of there's a great bit of writing in there, and like hanging a lantern on the moment where Picard himself points out the irony of her of all people establishing a fleet, an interconnected fleet that could be controlled from basically a single ship kind of thing. Like, how very Borg of her, when she should be the person who's like very much against that, since she's supposed to be like the Borg specialist. She comes
Yeah.
from
Well,
like
maybe that's what she
Starfleet
got
sort
the
of,
idea. She's like,
but just the irony of that, and it's like, wow, they
yeah.
kind of did her dirty at the end there, and you're right, she just kind of gets murked in the face, and it's like, I was glad to see the cameo of her return. This isn't a Picard review again, but in sort of retrospect of this episode, or like connected to this episode, seeing her
Yeah.
again was a nice treat. But it's also like she's there, she's gone, has this moment of hubris, and then like kind of gets shot in the ass with her own gun kind of thing. Um,
But I wanted to say just just a little side note, she happens to be, if you can't figure it out, Brian Dennehy's daughter.
that I did not
And
connect.
yeah, and the other notable guest star is George Murdoch, who plays Admiral Hansen, who I doing some research found out I mean, so many people have done so many multiple roles for Trek, everyone, it's like a thing, like everyone plays 8 roles for Trek. Like there's a joke about how many people Jeffrey Combs has played. Like no matter how many species, no matter how many planets we go to, they all have a Jeffrey Combs. But George Murdoch played the god entity in Star Trek 5,
Which
and he
is such a
returns
weird sort of like the difference in those characters. Like I understand, like he's a character actor within the context of this, and like they can play different roles. But like, what a like oddly like diametrically, not even diametrically opposed, but like just very different characters that he's playing. Whereas like
Mhm.
one is a human admiral, the other one's like God question mark, and it's like I don't know, it's just bizarre. Fun little
Another thing
intro.
I wanted to get out off my chest right away is that you talk about this is Riker's episode, sort of his arc. He's offered the command of the ship called the Melbourne,
Yeah.
and I would have passed that up too because you got to have a ship with a cool name. You know, if you're gonna go through all this and be this like legendary captain, the legendary captain of the Melbourne, no, like, and as we all know, when Riker finally did accept a command of his own, 15 years after being commander of the Enterprise, which is kind of funny because they said in this episode he's been offered command 3 times in 3 years. So does that mean he was offered command 15 times over 15 years? But when he
I have a
finally
feeling
does
the
accept
Starfleet command just kind of gave up at a certain point.
and when he finally does accept the command, it's the Titan, the Titan. And it just yeah, like I'm not fucking taking a ship called the Melbourne. Fuck you. Give me a come when you have a cool name.
I mean, to be fair, a lot of the ships have like weird,
Yeah, like the
kind
Crazy
of silly.
Horse.
The Yorktown. It's like
Yeah.
there are
Well,
all kinds of weird, poorly named ships throughout the series, and they can't all be the Enterprise or
right.
the
But
Excelsior.
the Excelsior, exactly. The So we talk about like this episode being like, yeah, this is it, this is the big one. When they engage the Borg, there's sort of this legendary, iconic moment of with this music composed by Ron Jones that became sort of very cool and iconic and was brought back for the Star Trek First Contact teaser.
Hmm.
And it has this choir in it. It's like it's so big, it's so verbose. It even has a and the producers of the show like heard this and they were like, Ron, do you think that's a little bit much? And Ron Jones was like, no, 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 because this is it, guys, right? This is like the big episode. This is like the end of the world. We don't know if we're gonna, survive this one. Like we got to do it, and they did it, and it is like really kind of almost over the top, but I love it. Like
A little
I
bit.
can watch that moment like when Magnify and the Borg cube comes in, like right when the music, it's so on the nose and overblown, but like it's so good.
Yeah.
And I think that what Ron Jones grasped is that when you do a TV show that has 26 episodes a season, you kind of got to do something to drive. If you want this to be like a big one and not just another one of the 26 episodes every season, you got to do something to sort of drive home the point, like, really let them know, like, no, guys, really pay attention to this one. And
Hmm.
that's what he did. But I love it. So,
It is a big moment. It's also a very well framed moment where, like you said, you've got the cube there, but you've also got like Picard standing in the foreground,
mhm.
um, kind of looking at his eventual sort of doom within this episode. You know, we all know what happens to him eventually, but within the context of the episode, again, we had no idea. We didn't know. And it was left on this cliffhanger. And unfortunately, like I didn't see it when it originally aired, but like I'm putting us in the frame of mind of like
Mhm.
having seen this without having seen part two and knowing what eventually comes kind of thing. And um the again, the foreshadowing in this episode is very kind of fascinating. Going back to another point you made, this being a Riker centric episode, it, looking back, we commented on how Q Who was basically a Q episode. Um, this ends up being a Riker episode, whereas the
Right,
next one is
right.
sort of like the crew trying to rescue Picard. Um, almost none of the like core canon sort of Borg episodes are about the Borg themselves. They're always sort of just like this floating and like this presence kind of thing in these episodes. I think like I guess you could argue Borg is kind of Borg centric, where it's about Hugh himself, but like again for this entity that's supposed to be like the big bad of the series, they don't use them very much, and it's never about them until we
Yeah.
get to First Contact, and even then it's more about you know
First contact.
it's about the First Contact. It's like it's weird that it's never they struggle so much to like create this species that is supposed to be this big threat, keep them as sort of like this non-entity entity kind of thing, but also make them the sort of like focus of the episode kind of thing. in terms of the narrative structure, because how do you do that with a species that is sort of faceless? And that's why I think Borg is such a fascinating episode, is because you sort of put a face and a personality to an individual Borg, but the Borg as a whole. And then eventually, we get the Queen. They wanted to
Yeah.
put a Queen in this episode.
Hmm.
They had the idea that they were going to do a basically like a queen bee, treating this as if it was a beehive, using a
Hmm.
queen bee as the central sort of entity. But they kind of brush it off as like, well, if you do that, you are putting a face to the Borg, and they become less of a sort of like um, haunting concept
Hmm.
kind of thing. It kind of humanizes them in a way, and they didn't want to do that. They ended up doing that anyway, but we can get to that when we get to First Contact. And I just
Yeah.
find it interesting that like these concepts come up, but then like they kind of brush them aside, and then they come back again.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So the other thing we have to mention is this is an episode that's a good example of the Worf factor. I don't know if it's the first episode that introduced the Worf factor or not. I'd have to go back. But for those who don't know, the Worf factor is a storytelling trope. Worf is sort of established on the show as being the physically most powerful member of the cast. And so, if you want to sort of show how big and tough someone is, the first thing you have them do is take out Worf. But it got so prevalent on the show that Worf just ended up looking like a giant because he's always getting taken out. But I remember sitting in the movie theater in 2018 watching Avengers Infinity War. And one of the very first things that happens in the movie is the Hulk comes out and Thanos just lays the Hulk out, just bodies the Hulk. And I'm sitting in the theater, I go, Warp Factor.
See, you call it the War factor. I think of it as the Colossus factor, where that was a recurring problem within the X-Men comics, was that was basically Colossus's only job, was to establish how big the bad was when they came along, was, they would immediately defeat Colossus because he was supposed to be the big, strong character. And it's like he would just get thrown aside, and it became this recurring joke where he was either Russian or the guy got his ass kicked. And it's like that's all he was for the longest time. Um,
Mhm.
and of course, both of them kind of grew out of that. And um, it would be interesting to do a sort of series on the Worf episodes, because like famously there was the box set for the Borg episodes that came
Mhm.
out, but there was also a Worf set talking about his sort of like lineage and
The
whatnot. And
Duras. Oh.
yeah, the Duras family and all that, but like talking about his lineage and his brother and his father, and the shame that he kind of takes on. It'd be interesting to do a series on those episodes, because they're also sort of like an interesting sort of canon within the series, an ongoing sort of story,
Mhm.
um, and really sort of made him a more interesting character, where he wasn't just the like growling security guard in the background kind of thing. Um, yeah,
The last or a couple more notes. One is we talked about last time sort of the hokiness of the Borg costumes in comparison to how they later did on even I'm so far ahead. I'm on Voyager, and even on that they've really got cooler bodysuits rather than just the unitards that they're wearing in this. And to be fair, Picard gets more added onto him in the next episode even. But this is just like he's in the black unitard, and then he has these abs, and I'm thinking those
yeah,
abs are really like that's a bad choice. Like why are there like people get hung up about the nipples in Batman? I'm like, why does Picard have abs? Like
yeah. I never understood that either. See, I like the design of these ones, because it's moving more into the sort of like the Borg look. Like it's not just the unitard with a bunch of like Home Depot piping and whatnot that they just kind of like paste onto them. And like you see like a little bit more variety in what the Borg are doing. It's not always the ones with the same like eye implant and whatnot. Like they have
yeah.
different implants and different like appendages, and some have like weird hat pieces, and um, a little bit more variety. I feel like they had a little bit more budget with this one to work with. Um, the design is really cool. I actually one of the other things that I found interesting looking this up is, I mentioned last episode how much I love the Borg cube design, but the physical actual construction of the model itself was like layers of like chicken wire plates that they built with like all these like greeblies and like pipes and kind of like um bits and bobs all over it. And like when you actually look at the Borg cube as it's like moving through space and whatnot, there's dimensionality to it, and there's like layers, and it's not just like you look at a normal ship and it's got like a physical exterior, like a covering and a plate, like cars do, and all kinds of other vehicles do. Whereas the Borg ship is just sort of like there's the concept being that there's sort of like no wasted sort of like effort put into it kind of thing. It's like all deliberate, and like there doesn't need to be a shell because it's so well designed kind of thing. And I don't know, I've always appreciated like the look of that, and like just how great it looks. We also talked last episode about the weird aspect of like the babies that they had. And if you watch these in order, like we're so familiar with the concept of Borg assimilating, but if you watch these, it feels like Picard is almost the first one that they actually assimilate.
Oh, it is. That was
It's
my
the
next
first time
note
we see them.
it's
It's the first time we see them actually assimilate anyone, but it becomes such a ubiquitous aspect of their canon that it's like we don't. Ryan loves when I use the word ubiquitous. He loves to point it out. But it's if you watch these in order, like you don't get the feeling that assimilation is their sort of methodology of like growing their species.
No, absolutely. Like as of this episode, they never use the word assimilation even. So like when Picard is taken from the Borg, again, if you're watching this from the perspective of someone in 1990, who's the Borg do not assimilate. That's even as far as this episode, at the end of this episode goes, the Borg, that's not their thing. And when Picard is taken, it's not seen as, oh, he's being assimilated like everyone else. It's being like, why did the Borg take him? Well, they want a representative, so they decided they make him like him. And they say, Dennehy or Shelby says he's been altered by the Borg, and Riker goes, altered, and Worf of course goes, he is a Borg. It's very new concept to them, and it remains a very new concept until the next episode, which is the very first episode in which they ever use the word assimilation, and B, suggest that that's what the Borg do. They kind of came up on the fly.
And Shelby even points out at one point, like, this is not their MO. What they usually do is they take the technology, and we don't know what they do with the people. But when they pluck these entire like cities out of the ground, which they've done a couple times now, this is the third instance of that. There's no mention of what they do with the biological aspect of that. They just take the technology. That's the only thing they've been interested in. So it's fascinating to see that context of like the drop concept of like the babies being assimilated or being like technologically sort of like augmented in the first episode. This one, it's the first time we see anyone taken and assimilated. But then like you get to Borg, and it's just sort of their MO. It's just like assumed that that's what they do. Resistance is futile, prepare to be assimilated. It's so weird seeing that evolution where like you take for granted that assimilation is their thing, and it's like no, that was a concept that they sort of developed on the fly, and it's fascinating to see that evolution of like this drop concept of like, how do they procreate? How do they carry on their species kind of thing? Are they one species? Well, no, because we now know that, they just take any species they want and add their biological distinctiveness to the group collective. But up until the next episode, that's not a thing. That's never happened. And it's like, and this being the core of the sort of Borg story, it's like, it's weird to see that development and see, it's sort of like counterintuitive to what we understand about the Borg.
You just made me think of something. It's so bad. You're like that. They want to add everyone's biological distinctiveness to them, which is what they say. But just now, it's made me think. Well, whatever you can say about the Borg, you have to admit they're big believers in diversity. They're very woke.
They're not. That's the problem, is that they're not woke because it's all sameness. It's complying to
they want to add
the status quo. No, they add, but
They,
it's like it's not celebrating the individuality of those, which would be the
sure.
woke sort of
Yeah.
perspective. It's forcing them to assimilate,
Hmm.
to become part of their collective, and not being individual, not having that sort of like uniqueness to them. It's
Hmm.
if you have some sort of thing that's just going to become part of the rest of us,
Yeah.
um, which we never really see them do anything with any of the distinctiveness of certain species. Um, like, if they assimilated a betazoid, are they
Hmm.
all of a sudden all empathic, which is kind of redundant because they all communicate
Yeah.
telepathically, sort of I don't know if you can really call it telepathically, subspace distortion field. I don't know what you would call it, but like how how do they incorporate the distinctiveness of species? We never see that
Yeah.
in terms of like, is there a unique species they adapted that the rest of the collective kind of takes on that attribute? When does
Hmm.
that happen? I would kind of like to see that explored. The other thing I kind of noted in this is I'm not entirely clear why they're so like. I understand from a writing perspective because humanity and Earth and the Federation are central to our characters and our the show and whatnot. But why are the Borg so obsessed with taking Earth?
Because it's the centerpiece of the Federation.
Why are they
I mean, you
obsessed with
take
the Federation though? Like from the
because the
very beginning, it
Federation's
seems
big.
it.
It's
Yeah, but why are they not like? Why don't we see them like that focused on taking the Dominion or taking the Klingons or taking the Romulans or any other group? Like it's from the very beginning, they are dead set. Like you could even argue that the ship that they encounter in Q Who is basically on a collision course already for Earth, based
well, it's
on
like
stuff that kind of comes
it's
later. And it's like
yeah,
I don't,
exactly.
I,
They're
I'm
going
I'm
for
unclear
Earth.
why they are so focused on going to Earth. What is it about Earth that's so important to them before they're
Well,
even kind of aware of the Federation?
yeah, like we said last episode, like they made first contact with the Federation, so that's who they're coming after. And it's just one instance, and then the only, like we've said multiple times, like the big thing about the Borg is they only really show up and invade twice in the whole show, including first contact. And so they go after Earth once because that's who they were made aware of. That's who they had first contact with. If you're going with the Enterprise episode, that's who the early Borg sent their message to.
Yeah,
And then you get to first contact, so they invade the Federation again instead of going after the Klingons or the
but
Romulans. I don't
that's
see that
that
as a
the entire time we know them within the context of the Next Generation. That is their sole focus.
right.
That is the
I
only thing they want to do. We never see them with any other sort of plot or strategy, or like we hear them going across the neutral zone, but we never hear about them trying to take over the Romulan Empire.
right because, like I said, they only invade twice, and I think the second time it's like, well, we tried
But we only really get the two instances of them. Like every other time, it's like
yeah.
I'm I would like that developed more, given some sort of reason why the Federation is so important to them and why the Queen is so obsessed to the point where they do something they've never done before. Take somebody to be a sort of consulate for them to communicate with Earth and facilitate a species they know is not going to go quietly, kind of thing.
Mhm.
Like it's that important to them, and I find that to be such an odd idea without it sort of like why are they sort of I don't know. I
Right.
just it's something that kind of bugged me in this episode. Not enough to like ruin the episode, but it's like it's not established
Why
as
is
to what.
why is everyone always headed for Earth? Like I remember watching the trailer for 20 years ago, watching the trailer for Nemesis, and Shinzon, the bad guy, is like, set the course for Earth, kill everything. And then of course,
Well, that's a
7 years
personal
after that, what's
vendetta
the
sort of thing.
yeah, but like 7 years later, what's the plot of Star Trek '09 is like they blow up Vulcan, they're like, all right, now we gotta go after Earth. Like
But
for
again,
being called Star Trek.
that's a personal vendetta, whereas the Borg are not a vendetta species.
Well, I mean,
And
yeah,
and
but
like
they're led by a queen. You got to remember they're led by a queen who does have full
at this point,
agency, and
no.
she,
Like we retconned, yes, but at this point in the story, no. And we don't understand like what the focus is. And I wish they had have like given some sort of I know it's supposed to be a non-entity species, like it's not supposed to have a face and whatnot, but
Mhm.
like there's clearly a intent here, and I don't understand what that intent is other than just assimilating Earth. What is that obsession, and why do they have that obsession kind of thing, as opposed to any other group or species that, they're kind of just ignoring at this point? Like, how many systems did they pass by on the way to Earth that they could have been assimilating as they went? And it's like,
Hmm.
no, their entire focus is just Sector 001. And it's like, I get it from a writing point of view because our perspective is from
Yes.
Earth and the main characters are from Earth, but it's like, I don't understand the motivation, and I wish that was something that they kind of, it doesn't break it for me. It's just sort of, something I noticed, and it's like, I do wish that they had kind of developed
Hmm.
that somehow. Like, one of the things I do enjoy about the later episodes, especially like Enterprise's episode in First Contact, is that like they establish why the Borg end up coming, because they end up sending themselves a message, 100 years in the past kind of thing about coming to Earth. But like, at least that kind of retcons a little bit and gives some reasoning for them to come straight there. But it's like, I still want to know why.
Hmm.
I don't know. Um, this is also the first time that we hear the very famous catchphrase that becomes ubiquitous for the species again: resistance is futile. That comes up again and again and again, and such and such is irrelevant. Strength is irrelevant, individuality is irrelevant. You will be added to our species, kind of like, just that catchphrase itself. Like, I don't know another species within Trek that has such a distinct catchphrase, to the point where like they used it in advertising,
Yeah.
not just for
For
these
the movie.
episodes or for the movie, or it was on like everything. Anytime the Borg were kind of put out there, that was the immediate sort of like tagline that they would use, was resistance is futile. And it's like,
Mhm.
I don't know, I love that. It's such a great line. It's such a great sort of like little bit of writing and dialogue, um, and so perfect for this species. And I just love that this is like, the first time we get that, and it's, um, yeah, I just love this episode all over.
Yeah. It's a good episode. It's might even be a great episode. But
I mean, this and the second one to me are like top 5 episodes of all of Trek.
yeah.
In
Well,
fact,
it's
like,
interesting. We'll get into this next time, but like the second episode got good reviews, but not anywhere near as good as the first one. Like if you look on like the Rotten Tomatoes score or whatever, it's like but to me, I think the second episode is by far the better episode. And we'll like in every respect, I think it just loads better, but we'll get into that next time. Yeah, again, I'm just when I think of this episode, I just think of, the opening of the eerie music, just like right off the bat, going straight into like this is like we're not fucking around this time, guys, and then getting all the way up to the choir music in the Borg cube, and it is a great episode for Riker. And his sort of character development of like, what am I still doing here? And then, of course, in part two, he's just like, no, I'm going to stay here because, I'm
I have a
Riker.
beef with how part 2 treats Riker, because I don't know if we want to hatch it out here or not, but
Well, we'll
basically
save it for next time. Yeah.
okay. Oh yeah, I'll take
But
that up next time.
well, but yeah, it's and then obviously with it, we've said it before, but like it's a good note to go out on, unless you have any like last thoughts. Is just that like we said, that finale, that cliffhanger is just so iconic, not only in
Yeah.
Trek terms, but in like the history of television. Again, I don't know. I couldn't tell you if any other show had a season-ending cliffhanger before. This might have been a novelty idea, but like I can just picture being a 14-year-old kid in 1990 watching Star Trek and Mr. Worf fire to be continued. What the fuck?
Yeah. And that was the thing. People held on. They wanted to know what was going to happen. That was, you know, that had never happened for Trek before. That had never happened in a lot of people's sort of experience with television, is that idea of like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And waiting the entire summer. Like that's become such a common thing now. Everybody
Mhm.
has cliffhangers every season. That's how you end your seasons now. But it's like, that was a new experience for people. A lot of people. It may not have been the first time it happened, but like a lot of people may not have, you know,
Mhm.
understood,
Absolutely.
like, had been through that before, and it's like the entire summer, the anticipation, and CBS played up on that again with advertising and teasing this episode alone, or the next episode alone, and like it's fascinating how you just the milestone that this episode is, not just within the Borg story, not just within Star Trek, the Next Generation, but just culture
In
itself.
television.
And
Yeah.
like, yeah, like people talk about, oh man, I wish I could like erase my memory and go back and experience something for the first time. It's like I'd love to see Star Wars for the first time again, kind of thing.
Mhm.
Or see Endgame again for the first time, or whatever it was, and experience that excitement of the shock and awe. Like this is one of those things that would be great to see live at the time, and like having that summer wait and the agony of waiting all summer, and
Yeah. And the
especially when
other
it's
thing
something
is,
you're
it's
not
like,
used to.
yeah, and you talk about this is when it stepped out of the shadow of the original series. It's also the end of season 3, which is as far as the original series got. So
Yeah,
the original series at the end of season 3 is like that's it. We get to the end of season 3 and we're like, Mr. War, fire. You know, like we're coming back, baby.
yeah, yeah. What a way to end it.
Yeah.
Great episode.
And I think on that note, yeah, I'll say it. You always talk about things you want me to be passionate about or whatever. Like tune in next time to leave that on a cliffhanger. I think part 2 is so much better. I don't even understand like I don't know. But yeah, we'll get there. And folks, thank you for watching. Click like, subscribe, all that shit. Uh until next time, I'm Ryan Murphy.
And I'm Shane Sheridan
Thank you for keeping it real,
with Real Time. Resistance is futile.
Mr. Worf. Fire.